Tajikistan has a president and it has a parliament. It's really a presidential system. Tajikistan became independent in 1991 and adopted a presidential system with a constitution. It's amended the constitution several times since then, and that has really had the effect of concentrating power in the hands of the president, who has been Emomali Rahmon, who's really been the head of state since late 1992, since the early stages of the civil war. So, as I said, it's a parliament with two chambers, but parliament, vis-a-vis the president, parliament's very weak. Rahmon has extensive presidential executive powers, so he's able to appoint the heads of provinces and heads of districts. He's able to appoint all heads to a variety of state committees, and really the recent changes in the structure of government and recent constitutional changes have had the effect of bringing more power into the hands of not just central government, but particularly the presidential administration. Political opposition was extremely important at the time of perestroika, so in the late Soviet period, independence in 1991 and the outbreak of civil war in 1991 to 1992. A number of political parties which were established then and which were opposed to the regime, including the Democratic Party and the Islamic Revival Party, still exist and are technically still in opposition. Part of the process, though, politically, of the civil war and the aftermath of the civil war was that the opposition in Tajikistan kind of became a dirty word. I think there was a period in the late 1980s, period of openness, glasnost perestroika, where there was real political activity and a real degree of pluralism emerging in Tajikistan, whereas today there's not a lot of popular support for political opposition. And so that really means that that's one reason why opposition is weak. The other, and probably more significant reason, is that the regime's control of politics has been increased since the civil war. There was a power-sharing agreement which involved the opposition, the United Tajik Opposition they were called, which was agreed in 1997. But after that process, after that time, opposition figures which were brought into government have gradually been excluded, and the elections have delivered overwhelming victories for the regime in the form of the People's Democratic Party, of which the president is the chairman. I myself was an election observer in 2005, the last parliamentary elections, and I witnessed the kind of manipulation of the ballot that you see in authoritarian systems, involvement by members of the state on the election day, manipulation of public information, so extreme limits placed in practice on the ability of the opposition to have television broadcasts and put its posters up and very practical things like that. And really, officers of the state, government officials, civil servants, being involved in supporting the People's Democratic Party and those politicians who are allied to the regime. So that briefly, the conclusions of the observers in 2000, the first post-war parliamentary elections were, 18, 19 people were killed in these elections, but the fact that they passed off at all was an achievement. I think in 2005, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was monitoring the elections, hoped to see an improvement in the elections, hoped to see more political space for opposition, and they didn't see that. The same problems really were repeated, and if anything, the system has become more closed, more authoritarian. There's been significant economic growth formally since really the turn of the century. So coming out of the Civil War, there was kind of a peace dividend economy came back to normal. High rates of international aid, increased foreign direct investment, meant that economic growth in the early part of this decade was at 8–10% per annum formally. The problem was there's a certain amount of artificialness to that. A lot of the growth, as I say, was part of this peace dividend. Another aspect was massive rates of external labour migration, largely to Russia, to a certain extent to Kazakhstan, and the remittances from migrants which came back into the economy were pushing economic growth, and they were also pushing up inflation, because a lot of those finances were being spent on consumption, rehabilitation of houses, this kind of thing, and that meant that inflation obviously was going up, but there wasn't real significant investment in the local economy. The reason for that, the reason there wasn't real significant investment in the local economy, is that the nature of the political economy of Tajikistan, where you basically need to be tied into the government, tied into the regime in order to, well, you needed to be a close ally of the regime in order to successfully buy enterprises in the privatization process, so that you win contracts in privatization, that you're able to buy land during the land reform process. So given that you needed to have good contacts in government in order to purchase land and to purchase enterprises and to have a stake in the economy, this meant that the migrant remittances, which are coming from poor to middle class families, people who have very little economic opportunity, there's limited opportunity obviously for them to invest in business, because they face all kinds of hurdles in the economy in terms of permits and inspections and all kinds of barriers to them kind of kickstarting the economy as entrepreneurs. Probably the biggest employer in Tajikistan is in agriculture, and particularly in cotton, and this has been something which has really developed through the Soviet Union. A cotton monoculture in Tajikistan, really, where large parts of the south of the country and significant parts of the north as well were developed with cotton. This led to a real damages to the soil and the environment. It led to salinization of the soil, and so by the last 10 or 20 years, there's been real problems with the degradation of the environment, and cotton yields have been going down. So this is the major sector of the economy. In the Soviet era, it was known as the national riches, and some in the regime still believe it to be so. But there are environmental problems today, as I've mentioned. There's also a major economic problem in the fact that all the farmers are in debt, and so this system is structured around debt, where futures companies give loans to farmers who are then forced to plant cotton and then repay the debts, repay the loans that they have, and so they're really in hock to these futures companies. They're in a difficult position. So cotton is one of the major sectors, but it's really struggling. Other areas, the biggest industrial sector is aluminium, a plant in a town called Tursunzade, near the capital Dushanbe. But the developing economic sector, what is really the kind of centre point of the government's economic development plans, is hydropower, particularly development of a number of major hydroelectric power stations, which were planned during the Soviet era, but are now trying to attract in outside funding from Russian companies, Iranian and Chinese. Tajikistan is a formerly secular state. The president and most in the regime would declare themselves to be Muslims, but their Islam is in no way political, and in many ways they come across as sort of secular figures, even secularist figures, who promote quite a secular agenda and the exclusion of religion from the political sphere, which is something of a bone of contention with groups like the Islamic Revival Party, although less of one now than it was. But that means that as a whole, yes, the formal position of the government is one of toleration for different faiths. However, that toleration has significant limits, particularly when it comes to any kind of proselytism by Christian groups or Islamic groups, but particularly by new Christian missionary groups in Tajikistan. So a number of churches, with most of whom have their roots overseas from foreign missionaries. A number of those churches have been closed down in recent years. But there is, whilst there might be an official policy of toleration, more generally there's also a heavy regulatory role for the state. So to get registered as a church or as a mosque is very difficult in Tajikistan. You need to get quite a large number of people to sign that they are regular attendees of this mosque, and in doing that they make themselves vulnerable, obviously, so it's extremely difficult. And there's been a lot of government harassment consequently of churches, mosques and even synagogues, and if churches and mosques ever get in the way of a government plan. For example, in the capital Dushanbe recently, there has been the mayor has been attempting to redevelop the city, and that's involved the destruction of a particular synagogue of the small Tajikistan Jewish community, and it seems like the government is willing to ride roughshod over religious groups and religious minorities in particular when they get in the way of state policy. It's difficult to say to what extent there's been a change since independence and women's position in Tajikistan. And across the Soviet Union, particularly Soviet Central Asia, there was an official promotion of the role of women, and in practice that seemed to mean that women took on this heavy dual role, that they were both expected to be workers and professionals, but also they were expected to, in the home, and even the Soviet state couldn't reach all the way into the home, they still played the leading role as homemakers, as carers of children. And so I think in some ways this has continued in Tajikistan since independence, but obviously poverty and the post-independence poverty and the civil war has its effects as well, in that the exodus of men on labour migration means that women's roles in the home can change a bit. There's an extra burden on them in some ways. They need to be able to, through subsistence farming or through shuttle trading or through selling off their leftover vegetables and fruit in the bazaar, they need to bring an income into the home. They can't necessarily rely on the migrant remittances from their husband or sons who are working overseas. So women have this extra economic burden, whilst at the same time still living within a very patriarchal system where the people in authority in the community will be male. The heads of the mosque, of the community as a whole, the government officials they deal with, on the whole they will be male. And as women, their gender role is perceived as still primarily being that of a kind of mother and carer. So there is huge gender inequality still in Tajikistan, and that's particularly, I suppose, that particularly comes across in the roles of the man and the woman in the family, where the man is seen as being responsible for the conduct of his wife and his children and keeping them in check, really. So that's the key area where gender roles are made manifest in the home. But obviously it doesn't stay in the home, it has an impact on broader society, on the economy, on political participation as well.